Welcome back to this topic on the deploying models, and we're going to continue our discussion on the REST-based web services. So this is the content, and we're going to talk about the REST web services. So continuing from where we left off the last time, we have actually HTTP, which is the common protocol used between the web server and the web browser, and this protocol is actually commonly implemented in all the web browsers as well as the web servers in the world. So we are not going to reinvent a new protocol, but we're going to borrow this protocol that's actually well established for the World Wide Web and use it as a means of exchanging information between our application and the model or the AI inference engine sitting in the backend. So we're not going to invent a new way of doing it. We're just going to borrow the mechanism that's really well established by the World Wide Web. So in this mechanism, the request and response between the server and the client is actually in a series of what we call HTTP messages. In more detail, the HTTP request and response, they actually share a similar structure as it's composed of a start line, which is part of the header information. Actually, it will have the name of the request, and then also it may also contain status information, for example, whether this request was a successful or is a failure. And the start line is always one single line. An optional set of HTTP headers specifying the request, or it may contain the body in the message. So actually the header after the start line, which is actually indicated here, the start line, the first line, there may be additional header information. Then after the header information, there will be the body, which may contain more data. Now there's normally a separation between the header and the additional information in the body. The body is optional. There may be cases where the request is just the request and there's no additional data in the body. Okay, so there's the option. So here's the format again, the start line with the request, for example, post or get, followed by the name, the request, the URL, followed by the protocol. And then there's a number of optional headers. Okay, normally there's at least the host information. That means where is the request being sent to. And then there's a blank line, and then followed by the optional body, which may contain data associated with request. For example, the content of a HTML form. You fill up a web form and you send this in a post request like this one, there may be information that's actually sent from the web form. And the document associated with the response. So if there's a response and you're trying to get back information from a web page, the HTML data may be contained inside the body. Okay, so start line and the HTTP, the start line and the HTTP headers of the HTTP message are collectively known as the head of the request. So the start line, the first line, plus the header is called the head, whereas the rest of it is simply the body. The body may have one or more parts, right? So it's not necessarily just one part. There may be multi-part in the body. So you can see that actually we can sort of hitch a ride using this mechanism to put our request. For example, the name of the request, right, could be placed inside the URL. So the URL will specify exactly what's the API call about, what is the resource you're getting, what's the model you're trying to access. All this information can be encoded in the URL. The type of action that you want, for example, you want to upload information maybe in the post. So the method would encode the action that you want inside this API call. Similarly, for the response, we can encode things like error, we couldn't find the resource you want, the URL is wrong, for example, or it doesn't have permission because the password or the key is not correct, like in this case, so it's forbidden, so there may be some authentication problem. Therefore, it's not able to give you the resource. Otherwise, it should be a 200 OK. That means it will give you the response of the request that you asked for. Now, HTTP methods, actually, there's a limited number of possible actions that you can do. So get, put, and post are the most common ones, but there's also additional optional ones like the head and options, and also there's also a delete action as well. So this describe the action to be performed together with the request, right? So if it's a get inside your request, then basically is to retrieve or read some information. So these HTTP requests are messages sent from the client to initiate the action on the server. Is on the start line, and this start line will contain the method, what is actually the request about. The next to the get, post, or put is the URL. Okay, exactly what's the resource that you're trying to retrieve from the server, and it will contain a protocol, a port, etc. Right, the name of the resource separated by /. The format of this request, it actually varies between different HTTP methods, but it's basically a web address or URL, and then followed by the HTTP version. So you have the start line basically consists of the method, one of the method. You cannot have two methods together, either a get, a put, a post, or delete. Only one method at a time, and then followed by a URL, and then followed by the version number of the HTTP protocol. So here are the commonly used methods that we actually use for REST-based API call, and they are also the methods that are typically used in the browser interaction as well. So we're going to hijack these methods to have a specific meaning. So for example, get is associated with an API call that reads data. So retrieving information or reading data, we would normally put it within the get request. So what exactly is the information that you're going to retrieve will be specified by the URL that's associated with the get. Post is going to be used for inserting data. Right, so it's going to be new data. You're going to add one more row. You're going to use post to do it. Put is for actually updating the data, or if you do a put with a new ID that's never been used, then it will also be used for inserting data. So if you know the create, read, create is actually basically this one, post, and then update will be put. Delete is obviously delete, and then read is basically implemented by the get method. So these are common operations that we'll need to do in any API call. So here is the overall flow. So the client, the browser, will send the request, and within the request, it may contain also additional information in the body. Right, so the get is actually inside the head. So the URL will specify where you should route that particular get request to. So on the web server itself, actually in our current configuration, we have the nginx as a web server, then we have a gateway implemented by Flask, and then the Flask will pass the information to the model. The AI inference engine will then respond back upwards to the web server, and finally the web server will send back the response. The message or the body of the message may contain the information that's being generated by the model, because this is a request coming in the get, put, post, or delete. The model would respond back according to what is the request being put forth to it through the REST API server. Typically, get is to just read information. So if you want to get a prediction without sending any additional information or writing any information to the server, this would basically be a get. If you're going to upload information, there's not going to update anything on the server, you would probably do a get, but you may put in some of the new data that you want to get a prediction for within the body of the get method. And this will then basically send the new data to the model. The model will do a prediction and then return the result from the get. So I would say that for AI inferencing, one of the most common would be a get. The put and post are more for updating. For example, you want to upload new training data, you would probably do a post, or you would actually do a put if you want to insert it line by line. And delete is just for refreshing or deleting resource. So if I have a particular thing that I'm not going to use anymore, I will send a delete with the ID, and then it will remove that resource from the server. So this is an example of how I would actually use it in a real application. So the resource is basically books. I want to actually retrieve information about books. So if you want to read information about a book of a particular ID or a particular title, so I will do a get slash books. We will this because it's slash books, it will get the list of all the books in the database. If I just want to get one single book, I will call a get with slash book slash the ID of the book. So it will just retrieve one book rather than a list of all the books. So this is a typical pattern that's being used whenever we use REST. So get with a resource that's basically a plural normally retrieves the list. If I want the individual items within the list, I would do a slash followed by with the ID itself. Now, if I want to delete a particular book from the database, I'll make a delete call followed by slash book followed by the ID of the book I want to delete. If I want to actually update some information or create a new book, I would call a post with the information about the new book with slash books, and this actually creates the book. And if I want to do update, I would call slash books followed by the ID of an existing book, and this will basically do the update by calling the put method. So and finally, there was a previous example I talked about if I want to retrieve one particular book, I just put books followed by the book ID. So the post is normally associated with create, and the put is actually associated with updates. So we don't need any additional method because this will be the common operations that we want to do. And the only thing that we need to be configuring in each case is actually the resource name, right? So if your model has to do with books, of course you can use slash books. But if your model has to do with maybe potholes or maybe the diabetes status, then it will be slash something else, right? So the resource actually is actually the name of the item of concern that you want to actually access. So what are some tips for effective REST-based API design? So in general, an effective design will have the following characteristic. It should be easy to read, so you don't use very strange descriptions, because that will be very difficult for you to understand. So calling it books, when it's about books, you call it A, B, C, D, E, F, right? Then nobody will understand that A, B, C, D, E, F has to do with books. So a well-designed API is easy to work with, and the resources and associated operations can be easily understood by just the name and the descriptor being used, instead of having the developer memorize what actually is the meaning of those resource names they're using. It's hard to misuse. It's another thing that you should try to aim for. Try to make it really idiot-proof by implementing and integrating an API with a good design with a straightforward process of using it is going to be more successful. Okay, so with less will be a less it should be a more straightforward process instead of very obscure manner of actually accessing a particular information. Informative feedback and doesn't enforce strict guidelines on the end user concept. So you don't try to be as flexible as possible so that the user can easily use it without having to follow a strict set of rules. Try to be as complete and as concise as possible. So a complete API should make it possible for the developer to get whatever it needs to be done, and able to expose all the data that you want to expose. Completeness happens typically over time. So initially, the API designer may not have thought of everything, but it's good to actually provide the basic set first and then incrementally build additional ones as you go along. Okay, ideally, every engineer or company with an API, that is the ideal that every company should strive towards. Some tips and tricks. Use nouns for the URLs. Right? For example, books don't use an action word, right? A verb. So for example, the URL should not have like walk, talk. It should be a path or road. Use a noun is better because it typically names a resource. So how you name things is using nouns. Describe the resource functionality with the method. So if do use the appropriate one, so don't use delete to update the information. Give examples for all your get response. So for all your get, normally get is has more variations because they may be getting many different resources. So provide examples of the URLs and what you want to retrieve, like what was done in the previous slide. Handle complexity elegantly. This is a very abstract concept, but what it means is try to keep things simple and not make things overly complicated. So there is an article here that you should take a look at on good practices in your API design. Now at the receiving end on the Flask server, actually you can actually put in things like this app route, which is a decorator, which tells it the server that whenever it gets a request for slash, it should call this function. So this route actually mechanism in Python to actually associate a particular URL with a particular function call. So when I do a get with slash, it will actually call the hello world. If I do a get from some other resource, so if there's no route, it will say not found, an error. But if I do a get with a slash, it will then call this function and then return the simple text hello world to the application. So this is how the routing is done on the server end. Okay, so the URL actually basically translates to a route. Typically, most of the routes are contained within one file, so you can see all the different functions that are being accessed with different URLs. But more complicated structures are possible, but it will be very much more convenient if we can have one single source of reference instead of having the routes put in several different files. So first of all, how do we do this? Is first import the Flask task, which is a Flask is actually implemented in Python. So you can import the module, create an instance of the Flask, then use the route decorator to tell what's the URL that triggers this function. There may be more than one app route, okay, with different URLs, and the function returns the message, which is then displayed on the user browser. So you can take a look at this quick start for more information. Now it's some time for a quick quiz on what you have learned about REST so far. So again, at the end of this question, so please pause before you think about the answer. The REST web service uses what? Blank. A, HTTP methods instead of custom functions. B, URLs to specify the resource location. C, HTTP parameters and content body to pass data. D, all of the above. E, none of the above is true. So pause a minute and think about the answer. And with that, we come to the end. Thank you for your attention, and I will see you in the next set of videos.